The Pelicans' schedule is here, and it is tough. I have the key stats you need to know, the games you need to watch, and the stretch that will make or break the season, plus all the info on the Pelicans' newest signing in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans at NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with you on this Wednesday. The show is going to be Wednesday, Thursday, Friday this week. Doing some traveling over the summer. Had real life get caught in the way. So we're going to kind of backload the week for you here on Locked On Pelicans. We got a week. We're going to talk about the schedule, the stats you need to know, a new Pelican on the team in today's episode. Tomorrow, we're going to look at Zion Williamson, who looks incredible, and a little bit of info on Herb Jones as well. And then we're going to finish out the week talking about a quest for 50 wins. There is one thing the Pelicans can do to get 50 wins this season. Yeah, I said it, 50, and it's easier than you might think. That's this week of Locked On Pelicans, so be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, where there's over 10,000 Pelicans fans right now. We are the #1 Pelicans podcast, so please become an everydayer. That means you listen Monday through Friday. We will be back to Monday through Friday. I know it's been a little bit inconsistent over the summer, but I need to recharge a little bit too. But now that the schedule's out, we know the next 9 months of our lives, and I'm looking forward to it. We got a lot of new stuff coming this year on the Locked On Pelicans podcast, so I'm excited. So let's get right into it. So today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Look, with the start of the NFL season, that is a real good offer, to be perfectly honest. Okay, let's get into the stuff with the schedule. One thing to note on the schedule that's released, it's only 80 games. Yes, there's 82 games in the regular season. 2 games will be added after the group stages of the NBA Cup games are played. More on those throughout the show here. Those will get added right around mid-December. So if you look at the schedule and you see a gap, there's going to be 2 games plugged in there, whether those are the knockout stages games or just 2 additional games that they end up playing if they don't advance. So keep that in mind when you look at it. So overall, the Pelicans' schedule is rather tough this year. There's not really any way getting around it. They have the 6th toughest strength of schedule. Their opponent win percentage is 51.8%. Now that takes last season into account, so that's a factor into it too. It doesn't necessarily project teams this season, but this is likely due to the Western Conference. The Western Conference is rough, and in fact, the Pelicans only play 29 games against a team with a losing record last season. It's because every team in the West was basically winning. All teams are going to have tougher strengths of schedules, basically, if you're in the West than if you're in the East. And that's no real surprise other than, of course, Denver for some reason, whose strength of schedule is the easiest this year. So right off the bat, it's a little bit tough. And then you start to get into the nuances of the schedule and you go, whoa, wait, what? The Pelicans are tied for the most back-to-back games this season with 16. Now, it's anywhere from 13 to 16, so it's a 3-game difference. It's not the end of the world, but the Pelicans are on the high end of that. And then what I like to look at is true rest advantage. If one team is off for 2 days and the other team is off of 1 day, it's not the biggest advantage because both teams, frankly, are rested. This is basically when you're playing a team on the second night of a back-to-back for them, when you have a true rest and you're rested. So a true rest advantage, this is where you can really take advantage. The problem here is the Pelicans only have 4 games, which is the fewest in the league, where they have a true rest advantage. The team that has the most is the Brooklyn Nets with 15. Most teams have 11 games with a true rest advantage. That's the highest number there. The Pelicans have just 4. They are by far the lowest team. No team just even has 5. The next closest team to them is Phoenix with 6. So they don't have as many true rest advantage games as you would like. So right there, you feel this is unfair, this is going to be hard, this is going to make things not easy. And in a sense, you're right. But they've done a good job of beating teams when they have an equal rest advantage. You can actually look that up from last season, and they've done a decent job when you just have equal rest of winning enough games. With equal rest since 2023, the Pelicans are 31-20. That's actually the 7th best winning percentage during that stretch. That's actually a pretty good record, all things considered, when you look at it like that. So as long as they're not getting too many rest disadvantages, I'm less worried about that. And so while the Pelicans don't have very many rest advantages, they actually also have the fewest true rest disadvantages. And I think that's the more important stat. They just have 6 games where they have a rest disadvantage. I don't know if it's the average, but the number with the most teams is 9. Goes all the way up to 13, which is Milwaukee and the Clippers. No team even have 7. The Pelicans are kind of a weird schedule here this year when it comes to rest advantage and rest disadvantage, true rest advantage and disadvantage, where they have the fewest of each of those. So when you look at that, they've done a good job of winning games when they have equal rest with their opponent. This doesn't really worry me with anything. And I think that's something that's worth keeping in mind here. Some of the other things you need to know about the Pelicans' schedule here is they've got 13 nationally televised games. This is down from, the height of the Zion era coming in, which shows kind of the shine has been taken off this team a little bit. Yes, back-to-back playoff appearances now, or, playoffs 2 out of 3 years, the play-in tournament every single year. But without winning a first-round series, the shine comes off a little bit here. 13 nationally televised games. 6 are on ESPN, at OKC on November 13th, at Denver February 5th, at Dallas February 21. You have home versus Memphis on March 9th, at Minnesota on March 19th, and at the Clippers on April 2nd. So just one home game during that stretch here. TNT is going to have 3 Pelicans games, at Golden State on October 29th, at Phoenix on February 27th, and home versus the Clippers on March 11th. And then NBA TV is going to have 4 games, and some can get flexed in, of course. At Memphis on November 29th, home versus the Knicks on December 21st, at Philly January 10th, and at Memphis in January 24th. So one of the things that says to me here is with that few national TV games on for home games, most of the games, by the way, are going to tip off at 7 p.m. You have one at 2:30, one at 6, 2 at 8:30 p.m., but we don't really have a lot of late-night tips here in New Orleans when it comes to this. Another kind of quirk of the schedule post-COVID is those baseball series games where you play a team twice in the same city on, either back-to-back nights or, in situations where maybe you have a day or two between all of them. They have 8 of those. They start off the season that way. Right? They're home versus Chicago. You've likely seen the schedule right now, so I don't need to run through the whole thing. And we'll get into stretches of it in big games in the next segment here. But they get 2 of these in their first, 7 games or so here. You home versus Chicago, then immediately go to Portland to play 2 games, and then immediately go to Golden State to play 2 games. I like getting those 2 Golden State games out of the way right off the bat and not get a ton of games against them later in the season, even if I don't think they're going to be as good as they've been in years past. You also have this at home versus Utah, at home versus Sacramento, and at home versus San Antonio too. Those Sacramento games, those San Antonio games are going to be trickier than they've been in the past. Sacramento, Pelicans kind of own that team. They're going to want a lot of revenge. Playing twice at home, I think, is a good thing. San Antonio is going to be tougher than they were a year ago because of Victor Wembanyama. But right after that San Antonio stretch, you go to play 2 games at Phoenix. You also have 2 at Denver like that, and at Minnesota. So if you can split those road games, that's pretty good because those are tough teams that you're going to need to play. And that means you're going 1-1 versus 0-2 because you've seen some teams make pretty good adjustments when it comes to those little baseball series. And that's why I think these are so fun. There's actually a time to put in true adjustments from one game to the next. And New Orleans has done a pretty good job of winning those over the past couple of years since they've been in. So those are kind of the basics of the schedule, in my opinion, that I think you need to know that make the schedule kind of interesting to look at now. But what about the actual games? What's the stretch that's going to make or break the Pelicans? I've got some key games that I've got circled on the calendar already. Let's talk about those. Let's talk about where the Pelicans can make or break their season. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by my favorite eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships. It's also what keeps your vehicle on the road with eBay Motors. So look, whether you're looking to add speed, power, style to your vehicle, eBay Motors has it. I work on all of my cars. I get all my parts from eBay Motors. They have everything I'm looking for because they have over 122 million parts for your vehicle. New car, old car, I'm working on both. They have it there, including one that's almost 50 years old, and I have no trouble getting parts from eBay Motors. And those parts fit because with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. And I love eBay Motors because the prices are good. You're burning rubber, not cash, with eBay Motors. So with all the parts you need at the prices you want, go shop and get everything you need for your vehicle, whatever it might be, over at eBay Motors. Keep your vehicle alive over at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well and become an everyday or listen Monday through Friday to Locked On Pelicans. And now for your second listen, enjoy the Locked On NBA podcast. There's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm on there every Wednesday, so you at least got to listen on Wednesdays. Talking Julius Randle and the Knicks, which was a really interesting conversation. Make or break players this year. Brandon Ingram came up in that one. Here's who some of the other names are. But right now, we're talking about the Pelicans' schedule this season and some games that I really have my eye on when it comes to it. And I have a couple written down here, and some happen earlier on in the season too. And the first game that really jumps out at me is a home game on November 3rd. November is actually a pretty crucial month, I think, to New Orleans. Is a bit of a litmus test for where they're going to be. First one is at home on November 3rd against the Atlanta Hawks. This is DeJounte Murray playing his former team that he was just traded from, where it didn't work out with him and Trae Young. A lot of motivation on his side on that. I'm going to be curious. Is the moment, is he kind of cool, composed in the moment? It feels like he will be, but that's always something that I'm interested in when it comes to these players. Do they try and make a point to stick it to their former team, or are they just going to kind of roll with it and do what's best and just get the win, and that's the ultimate revenge? On the flip side of that, by the way, you go to at Atlanta a month later on December 2nd. That's going to be his first time on the road back in Atlanta. I always find those kind of interesting too. The other first real big home game to me is still in the month of November. Like I said, November's big. You're at home versus Denver on November 15th. This is also an NBA Cup game, so the cool courts, the uniforms, all of that. But Denver is not as good as they were a year ago, even as 2 years ago. But they still have Nikola Jokic. They still have Jamal Murray. Michael Porter Jr. is there. How do you stack up with a team that's expected to be in the top 4 of the Western Conference? You haven't really played, that game just yet. Yes, you go on the road, play at Oklahoma City on the 13th. So the game before this one, that I also think is a big test, given that you played against them in the playoffs and they swept you. How do you respond to that? There's another OKC game that I think is potentially going to be more important, and that's later in the season that we'll get to in a minute here. So the first big home game I'm looking at is Denver in that NBA Cup game. Then immediately in a couple of games, you're on the road at Dallas in an NBA Cup game on November 19th as well. That's really the stretch that looks kind of important. November, we'll see if this team, given that they play teams like Cleveland, Orlando, OKC, Denver, the Lakers, Dallas, right? You get a Golden State game in there, Indiana, Memphis. All of those are kind of litmus test games for me of where is this team? Do they look like they can break into the top 4? Do they need to make moves? Because that's going to inform what this team does leading up to the NBA's trade deadline. And I think we'll have a pretty good idea of who this team is during November in that stretch. If they win some of those games, those are statement games I think that you can get. And if you win those, we're going to be like, oh, maybe this team's going to be better than we thought. And if they don't, they probably need to make a move and get a center. And that will then maybe influence what they do at the trade deadline when it comes to all of that. Another area that I look at is the end of the regular season. The final 10, 15 games are always massively important to me because we're not expecting the Pelicans to kind of run away with a top seed. They're going to be in a fight, right, with a lot of teams in the Western Conference. So the final stretch of the season can make or break you. We saw it happen this past year when I didn't think it would happen even, where the Pelicans went from, at one point, the 4th seed, the 5th seed, the 6th seed in the Western Conference to the play-in tournament. And you can fall if you don't win those games, right? If the Pelicans had won one more game, beating the Lakers, you don't end up in the play-in tournament and take your chances there. So the final stretch to me is the most make or break, starting with those 2 games at Minnesota. Minnesota might have a lot to play for. They need to get those wins. But after that, you get somewhat of a gimme at Detroit. Then you're home against Philadelphia. They're going to be fighting for playoff seeding. Home against Golden State. They're likely going to be at least trying to get into the postseason, maybe through the play-in tournament. You are at home against Charlotte when that should be an easy win. Then you get 2 games in LA, the Clippers, the Lakers. One of those is going to be tough. I'm not high on the Clippers this year. Back home against Orlando, who's given New Orleans tons of trouble. On the road to Brooklyn, that should be a win. On the road to Milwaukee, that is a tough one. And then you close out the season with 2 home games, Miami and Oklahoma City. So the Miami game, they might be resting players, but they're likely going to be a play-in tournament team, so that's not an easy one. It could come down to that final game against the Oklahoma City Thunder. And here's the thing. That means if Oklahoma City is better than New Orleans, as we're expecting this year, they can influence things. They can rest their starters, lose that game. Maybe New Orleans gets a better seed. Maybe they play New Orleans in the first round. That game against OKC is going to be the most important one, and it's more, will OKC play everybody, or are they going to rest some players and give that game to New Orleans? Does that get New Orleans into the playoffs? Does that get them into the play-in tournament? Does that eliminate them in some capacity or even change their seeding? That game and what OKC does, given how badly they beat New Orleans in the playoffs, is the type of thing that concerns me, where there's just so much you don't control in that sort of setting, and I don't find that a fun position to be in whatsoever when it comes to a lot of that. A couple other notes from the play, from everything here. New Orleans is a 5-game home stretch from December 21st through December 30th. There's some tough teams in there: New York, Denver, Houston, Memphis, Clippers. We'll talk more about this. This is the Friday show, how to get to 50 wins. Winning at home is the key to that. Spoiler alert. You got to go 4-1 in that stretch. 3-2 at the bare minimum. 4-1 is really what you need. New Orleans needs to be more of a home team than they were this past year. That's a stretch where if you get some wins there, you're like, oh, they're defending home court. That changes the trajectory of the season for the Pelicans, in my opinion. What's also good, despite a Super Bowl being in New Orleans, Mardi Gras, there's no exceptionally long road trip. They have 4 consecutive road games 3 different times. I think that's not too bad of a stretch for New Orleans and what to kind of expect. It starts, the beginning of the season at Portland, 2 games at Golden State. You could, in theory, go 4-0 there, given that we expect the Golden State Warriors to be much worse. Though stretch in February, I think, is a little bit tough. At Denver twice, at Sacramento, at OKC, that's certainly not going to be easy. And then between February and March, you have 2 games at Phoenix, then at Utah, and at the Lakers. That's not going to be easy at all. But if you can go 1-1 with Phoenix, that's going to make that road trip really worthwhile to me. And given it's one of those baseball series, I think they're going to be capable of doing that. Overall, while the strength of schedule is tough, I'm not looking at that because every team in the West is kind of like that for the most part. Don't hold me to that, but in general, that's what it is. And, they don't really have a major rest disadvantage. And to me, that's the most telling thing, given their record with equal rest over the past couple of years. If that's the majority of their games, they're going to be okay, I think. And that's one of the reasons why when I look at the schedule, yeah, it's tough, but there's reasons to be optimistic when it comes to certain things with it. So coming up next, did we just get the Naji Marshall replacement maybe. Javonte Green signed to the Pelicans. I'll tell you kind of what it means for the salary cap, what it means for the roster, and what his role likely is going to be on this team. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel. So now we've got something a little bit different for you, because through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5, and then you get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. You want to watch everything around the NFL? You get a free 3-week trial, watch all of the games, by placing just a $5 bet on FanDuel. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you're going to be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game, and all you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you can cancel any time. So just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. Look, they got the lines for the opening games of the NBA season. Pelicans being favored by 2.5 at home over the Chicago Bulls. I feel good about that one. I feel good about their start to the year and think they can really kind of beat the brakes off some of these teams, get off to a 5-0 start, a 4-1 start, and that would be absolutely fantastic. We'll have more on the schedule coming up in Friday's episode of Locked On Pelicans, but visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started here. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube. And now for your second listen, Locked On Saints with Ross Jackson. He was out there practice at Yeoman Stadium on Tulane's campus, the open practice. Look, Derek Carr was signing autographs for like an hour after that. I dig that kind of fan interaction. Maybe that'll make me come around on Derek Carr. He's got the quarterback situation looking at Trevor Penning in the offensive line. Ross Jackson, Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. That is your second listen today. So final news of probably the offseason for New Orleans for right now. According to Shams Charania, the Pelicans have signed Javonte Green, 6'5" wing who played with predominantly his career with the Chicago Bulls. Started with Boston, traded to Chicago, has been there for a while. Only played in 9 games. He was cut by the Warriors in this last offseason, then re-signed with the Bulls in April. Played in 9 games, 5 starts, and did pretty well. 12.2 points per game last season, 1.1 steals. He shot 3 threes a game, 37% from deep. Those are pretty decent numbers. For his career, he's averaged 5.4 points per game, about a steal per, and is a 34.5% shooter from 3, though with Chicago, that was significantly better than his time in Boston. It's 36.3% there. You know, they wanted a little bit more depth on the wing after losing Naji Marshall, Dyson Daniels feeling a little bit thin there. You know, this is kind of, I think, the Naji Marshall replacement. This is a guy that likes to play fast, force a steal, get out and run. That's kind of what he does. And this is just cheap wing depth when you can never have too much of that. And while they weren't going to give Naji Marshall that kind of contract, signing him on a veteran minimum deal, which now puts the Pelicans somewhere between like $2.5 to $3 million into the luxury tax. Got to finalize the numbers here. You know, puts them about like $4 million in terms of payment. They may make some moves later, but they didn't need to fill this spot. They're signing him because they must see something and really feel like they need a little bit of depth there. And he kind of fills a role. You know, this is not someone you want playing heavy minutes in the NBA. Though last season with the Chicago Bulls, again, only 9 games, small sample size, 5 starts, 25 minutes per. His career averages are 16.3 minutes per game. But it's someone who I think can fill the Naji Marshall role. Play some hard-nosed defense, try and get out and run in transition, shoot some threes on offense, and just do a lot of the dirty work. And while he's not a direct replacement for Naji Marshall whatsoever, again, he closed last season well. And for a cheap signing, this is good. And it's also nice to see the Pelicans like do this and not be completely cheap, in my opinion, because they didn't need to do this. They're deeper into the luxury tax than they were a moment ago. And while it might not be significant, they haven't always done moves like this. And we thought they might keep this roster spot open. But now the roster is set. This is everyone on the team. And we kind of have an idea of what the rotation will start to look like as we get towards media day and training camp. As a flyer, as just an easy signing that gives you a little bit of depth, break glass in case of emergency, Green is fine. He's 31. He's not going to light up the league here or anything like that. But as someone to play when guys are injured or in foul trouble to kind of get some minutes on the wing, spell Herb Jones on occasion, especially after losing Dyson Daniels, after losing Naji Marshall. You could do worse than this. This is a smart signing, in my opinion, when it comes to this sort of move. So, like it from the Pelicans. There you go. That's kind of the role you see him playing this year. This is someone who, again, fits the way the Pelicans want to play. Is an above average defender, in my opinion, from when you've watched him. Not borderlining on good, but, trending more that way than worse than that. And the fact that he can force those steals, get out and run, that's kind of exactly what you're looking for. He's also a pretty good rebounder for his size. And if the Pelicans are going to need to kind of commit to team rebounding, gang rebounding a little bit more, you could do worse than Javonte Green here. So overall, I think this is good move for New Orleans, just nice little depth piece, but not anything that's going to set them over the edge. Do you like the signing? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. We're just getting the week started here on Wednesday. More to come tomorrow with Zion Williamson and Herb Jones. We're looking at some 2K ratings and a couple of other things around the league as well. And then, of course, we're going to get back into the quest for 50 wins. More on the schedule on Friday's show. This has been the Locked On Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, @NOLAJake on Twitter, and I'll see y'all tomorrow.